everybody, this is Dahlia here and welcome to my first Sims 4 tutorial video. Today we're going to talk about landscaping tips. With all the amazing interior design videos that are out there already, I thought it might be cool to contribute to a bit of the brain trust with respect to landscaping. Firstly, I would like to say thank you so much to everyone who's been liking, commenting, subscribing lately. My videos have been getting a lot more activity over the past couple weeks to a month, and I really appreciate that. So I wanted to say thank you by giving you a little bit of a look at how I landscape. Not that it's particularly brilliant, and I'm by no means a landscape architect or qualified in any way, besides really the qualification of spending way too much time playing this game. Hopefully you'll be able to take something from this that you'll find helpful. So to bring the tips and tricks to life, I thought it might be best if we did a little landscaping together with an example lot. I chose this very sad, very under-landscaped Havisham house in Windenburg to give you a look at how it is that I landscape and show you what a big difference it can make when you're utilizing the outdoor space in a really cool and, hopefully aesthetically pleasant way. My first tip comes before you even launch your game, and that is just to think about what style you want. So what I mean by this is just have a quick think about how you want it to look. What's the aesthetic? Are you looking for something to match the style of the home? Do you want something completely different? And then with respect to landscaping, like there's so many different styles of gardens. You've got, for example, just to name a few, modern, French, Japanese, arid, Mediterranean, and whatever this weird thing is. Now, I find that the easiest way to get some inspiration and to get a better idea of what these different styles look like is to actually just go onto landscaping websites for real life. And there's a few that I've posted links to in the description. And there's one website which I think is really brilliant, which has a little style guide that you can get for most of their different styles of landscaping, and it shows you so much. It has how you would add decor, what color palette you would use, what the plants look like, if you're going to put outdoor furniture out, what sort of fabrics to have. I mean, it's really comprehensive. So definitely check that out if you're looking for ideas and you want to know a little bit more about what different styles of gardens might look like. So my second tip is a bit of a continuation of the first one, but basically it's just to consider the use of space. And this doesn't, again, have to be anything particularly onerous or time consuming. By this, I just mean look at your lot that you have to landscape. Is it a 64 by 64? In that case, you might realize that you have a lot of land to fill and you're going to want to put a lot of stuff in it. Or maybe, like in the Hamptons manner that I did, you want really big green rolling lawns. And so you want to sort of cluster the stuff that you've got going on. Or maybe you've got a smaller lot and you don't really need as much stuff, or you want to find a way to fit a lot of things on a smaller space by being efficient about your use. I mean, it goes on and on and on, all the possibilities. And just to give you some examples, like here's some of the lots that I've done before, and they've just done some little diagramming, some very expert landscaping architecture. So you can see exactly how the space was used in these lots. And it's very different lot to lot. So that's something just to keep in mind. Totally subject to change like anything that you do, but always a good thing to know. And I think following on from that, something that I do find helpful is to start from the big things. So drop your pool where you want it and, maybe some of the main outdoor living spaces. And then from there, you can fill in beds and everything. And the rest just kind of builds itself as you go. So let's go to our house. Here we have the very dreadfully landscaped Havisham house, which again, it's not horrible, but I mean, I think we can do a little bit better than this. So let's get rid of all our plants and get ourselves to a blank slate. And this will now take us to tip number 3, which is cheat. Now, this is a good tip for The Sims, not probably a great tip for like the rest of life, but hey, you do you. So in this case, there are 2 cheats that are your friend, and I'm sure if you've watched any Sims tutorial videos whatsoever, you are super well familiar with them, so I won't spend much time. But basically just wanted to reiterate that if you enter the cheats bb.show hidden objects and bb.show live edit objects, you have access to the debug menu, which has so much extra stuff and is definitely worth at least having a look through and getting a bit familiar with it. Now, I'm not going to take you through the list of debug things. There are some really brilliant tutorials that do, like Simspo has one, for example. But one thing I will point out is this lovely round planter thing. I've used it many times before. It's very versatile. I think I've used it as a fire pit as well. The other object that I would point out, which I also find helpful and I use in a lot of my builds, is this little paver thing. Really great for lining pathways and lining garden beds. So my fourth tip is to vary the levels in your landscaping. What this could just mean is that you take your foundation of your house and you raise it up so that you have a little bit of a porch type area. Now for this English cottage garden, which I thought would be a cool look for the very Tudor style of this house, I was inspired by some photos, which you can see on the screen, and one of them had some steps and a lovely row of flowers and planters, and I thought, gee, it would be great if we could have some steps in this build, and obviously there aren't any right now. So what I did to then vary the levels was just to raise up the foundation a little bit, and then from there be able to build this little patio thing. And that creates a lot of visual interest that wasn't there before. It's a really easy way of doing it. Of course, you can do some amazing landscaping with hills and valleys, and I mean, just look at Kate Emerald's videos. It's like insane the kind of stuff she thinks up. So as you can see, I'm just going through quickly and doing all the amendments to make my little porch look okay. And then I've decided to fence off the garden area for a bit of privacy, given that Windenburg is a bit of an urban area in this area. And there we go, I've got my other stairs. So my fifth tip is to sketch with terrain paints. And by this I mean that when you're plotting out things like your footpaths and your garden beds, it's really helpful, I find, to just use the terrain paints, even if it's not the final color that you end up going with, just to sort of block out these areas, almost as if you're drawing, basically. So I've gone through in the build, like you can see, and I've done just that. I've drawn an area where I want my path to be and drawn a bit to the stairs so you can actually use them. And then I've just used the dirt terrain paint to sort of sketch in where I want the garden beds to be. And I find this sort of visual is very helpful, although obviously not set in stone. So if you decide down the track, hey, actually I really don't want this garden bed like this, it's super easy to fix because it's just terrain paint. And I think I do actually change one of the front garden beds between this sample that I do here and then the final product, which you'll see, because I decided that it would look better with a bit of grass there. So yeah, it's really just like keep tweaking it and decide what you like, what looks all right, and don't be afraid to experiment or to sort of try an idea, and if it doesn't work, try another idea. And that will then bring us to our next tip once we place this fence. And that is to start with trees. Now, it doesn't have to be trees, but I always, like I found with dividing up the space, if you anchor it to the most prominent feature in the area, and in this case landscaping, I always find trees are, the biggest, most prominent part of landscaping, then that gives you a good idea, I think, of what your focal points are going to be and how you want to lay out the rest of the plants. Trees, of course, can come out of flower beds or they can be out of grass. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. But as you can see, just picked a couple here. I've done a lot of experimenting. Like I had these little cypress trees, but then thought, no, I don't really like the way that looks. So just give it a bit of a experiment with your different types of trees and see what looks good to you. As you can see, I've ended up changing the placement of the door because I thought it was weird to have it sort of around the corner and behind a tree like that. So it was one thing I did do to the build, but I consider that a minor renovation. So tip number 7 is to mix it up with planters. So you don't just need to have flowers coming out of the ground, but you can also bring a lot of interest and make it look more realistic by having planters and even indoor decor plants. One thing that I do is grab those activity planter things and then just put build mode plant or something in them. Of course, then they're not very functional to plant in-game plants, but I mean, I'm really doing it more for decoration. Tip number 8, speaking of plants, is to make a plant palette. This is probably one of the most important things that I do with every landscape, and it's so helpful. So what you want to do is basically just make a palette of the different plants that you think you want to use in this landscape. And obviously this is very subject to change, and if you decide there's something that you missed or that you actually don't want in there, you can change it up, which you'll see me do in this video. And when you do this, it's a really good idea to keep a different, functions of plants in the back of your mind, and to say, okay, so you want some ground cover plants versus do you want some pops of color, so some flowers, and then think about what do you want that has a bit more vertical coverage, shrubberies, bushes, that kind of thing, in addition to the more sort of hedge-like plants that are still flowering. And then, of course, wall ivies and anything that you want to cover a wall space. So once you have thought about these things and kind of have pulled out some plants, it's probably the most helpful just to kind of cluster them there together. And by making this palette, you're able to then use the eyedropper tool to go back and select the plant that you want. And that way you don't move it out of its position, but you can very easily create a clone of it to put in your garden bed, and you're not having to look through the catalog constantly. One tip with the plant palette, which you may or may not find terribly helpful, is to build a little room around it, just with a foundation or something. And in doing this, it makes it portable, which is pretty helpful. And except for when you make it too big, like in this case. But I do this generally when I've got a pretty big lot and I have different beds that are spaced far apart. That way I can move all my flowers around and I don't have to keep scrolling back. What we're gonna do now is we're just gonna landscape this little garden bed together, and then I'm gonna jump to the finished product because you probably don't want to sit through some super speeded up version of me doing the rest of this. So let's start. We've got our lovely delphiniums and we want them right here in the corner close to the wall. Well, as you can see, when you get too close to a foundation, plants will snap to the level of the foundation and effectively float, which probably not ideal unless you're going for like a super sci-fi type thing. In this case, we don't really want floating plants. So how do we fix this? There's a very simple and very clever solution to this, and that is through something that is called the T.O.O.L. So tip number 9, get it. Oh my gosh, if you get any type of custom content or mods in your game, I definitely recommend the red shelf, of course, but also the T.O.O.L. Oh, the T.O.O.L is so cool. So it's created by this amazing modder gamer named Twisted Mexi. And he has, by the way, like a jillion really cool mods worth checking out. But the T.O.O.L is basically something that allows you to move things with no limitations. I'm not going to go into the functionality of it or give you much in the way of tutorial because there are some amazing tool tutorials that already exist, which I have linked. Just to give you some examples, RGR Gaming, Schnuck, and Sims 4 Creations have brilliant step-by-step tutorials about some of the things they've done with the tool. I really just recommend getting to know it by playing with it yourself, experimenting, seeing what sort of things you can create when you get the tool, but it definitely brings your builds to the next level. So here we go, we've got the tool, and we're going to elevate our delphiniums in a negative direction so that they move down. And this is a little bit of guesswork. I couldn't really tell from looking at it how high they needed to be, so a little bit of trial and error. Okay, that's that. I mean, the biggest drawback, of course, is that you have to go back to live mode, so when you do that, you will lose your ability to press undo. But if you don't have anything that you're particularly concerned about having to then undo, it's super easy to just hop back and forth between live mode and build mode. So we've got our delphinium no longer floating. Let's move our tree so we can see a bit more what we're doing. And basically just going forward, making clones of my objects or my plants and moving them in a configuration that is aesthetically pleasant. So this part really doesn't have much of a tip to it. It's more just make it pretty. Do whatever you like. As you can see, I've got my ground plant there, and that one's definitely going to need the tool because it's a pretty big surface area that loves to get raised up onto that level of the foundation. So as you can see, tool makes it super easy and elegant. Now it's actually on the ground. So we add our other little flowers. You can see I'm creating different levels, some that cover the wall and the foundation bit. And another thing that I often do as well is if I want a higher plant, but I don't want to make it bigger, all I do is just raise it up a little bit. If it's behind another plant, you can't see that it's floating. So you can effectively build your own plants and make them taller if you layer them in this way and you have some ground cover in front of them so you can't see that this is what's being done. So I've done that quite a bit in this garden, and you'll see it in the final version. And especially if you download it, I'll put it in my gallery. You can have a play with some of the different garden beds, deconstruct them, reverse engineer, and you'll notice like I've done this sort of cascading flowers kind of thing where I've just got them almost like going vertically on top of each other to build a higher plant that's not also physically bigger in scale. So we're just gonna go through and finish up with our plants here. Since this is the English cottage garden, it's pretty free and is not super structured, but at the same time, it's not unruly looking. It's got a lot of different colors, but I've tried to keep everything to sort of that pink and purple palette with a bit of white, and basically just keep putting things to places where I'm happy with them. Again, we've got a tool related issue here because I could move it out a bit and away from the foundation, but I really like the scale of it pressed in there, tucked in, covering up the corner. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of an idea about how you might go about landscaping a garden bed. And really from there, it's like rinse and repeat and just do the same thing. And remember that in nature, generally, you have a little bit of variation between the plants that grow. But if you have a super ordered traditional garden, then you probably will have, things very neatly in a row that don't look quite as natural. So again, like a lot really just depends on the style that you've chosen, which was our first step, and the inspiration that you've drawn. So let's skip ahead as we go and get to our next tip, which is rocks are your friends, which is kind of a silly name for tip, but basically just don't forget rocks. Now, you've got a heap of debug rocks available in the live edit objects, but for now, even just talking about these little rocks that are in the build mode, they're super helpful to frame a part of a garden, to put between plants, to make it look a bit more natural. Sometimes I put a little bit of grass, like you can see, growing around and over the rocks because it looks, again, a bit more natural. In this case, I've just used those rocks as little accents. You can even line your garden bed with that if you want something that's a little less tidy looking than those pavers that I showed you earlier. So tip 11 is use bimode accents. And that's anything from sculptures to fountains. Basically, like I said earlier, just remember landscaping doesn't have to be things that come out of the ground. So for instance, like I used this sculpture. I liked the look of it. It wasn't too massively grand for this little cottage garden. And I've put that there. With fountains, you've got heaps to choose from. And this modern circle thing and this 3-tiered thing. And yeah, there's a lot out there. One thing, yeah, I really love that circle. I've used that before, as you will see in my builds. One thing that's really cool is these jet emitters. They're really, really nice tools to create custom water features. Like if I wanted to make it a fountain out of this statue, I could have, but it would have looked weird. So definitely another thing to play with, a really cool accent. The only thing that kind of bugs me is that they have light coming out of them, so that kind of will undermine the realistic look sometimes, but it's not quite perfect, but it's pretty darn good. So I've just added some really low hedges here, as you can see, just to frame the horizontal bit of the wall and give it a softer look than just having the grass meet the wall directly. And yeah, I think that's looking pretty good. So let's move our tree back, and that will take us to our next tip, which is create depth with paint. So what I mean by this is use your terrain paints and create things like dirt under your tree or shadows or a little bit under your garden bed, for instance. If you don't want to do the whole garden bed in dirt, at least do the edges of the plants, and it creates depth. It makes it look a little bit more natural, like it's not just coming out of this completely flat green surface that's meant to be grass. Because of course in real life grass isn't completely flat like that, but unless you want to use the little grass thing all over your lot, which might look kind of cluttered, you kind of have to use a little bit of visual tricks to make things look more natural. So in this case, I've also added some rocks and some flowers and grass around my tree, just another example of how you might blend in a tree if it's coming out of grass, make it look more like a focal point. So yeah, there's an example, and I've added a little bit more dirt underneath the rocks and flowers. So one eternity later, we return to the finished product. As you can see, I've basically just done what I did in that corner and done it throughout the entire lot. So the color scheme is pretty consistent. The use of plants is consistent. I've tried to make little areas, so there's like a little meditation spot, there's a little eating area, I've got a little gardening area with pots, bird feeder. One thing I've seen some other builders do, which I think is really cool, is they stack these pots like that and make it look like you've got this selection of empty pots that your sim is going to put things in at some point. Like, it's just a really cool decorative touch, but I didn't end up doing that in this one. And then I've got a little area for barbecuing and a place to sit, read a book right in the front, and then another little sitting area. You'll probably also notice that I've done heaps of little ivies up the wall because I thought it's a Tudor house. It reminds me a lot of some of those pictures. It would be a total shame not to have some cool greenery going up the walls. And now that takes us to tip number 13, which is do not forget lights. So that's an important thing, is half the time your house is going to be dark as it is going to be light. So you're going to want some lights. And these are just as important as any other accent that you'll use. So I always put it in night mode and make sure that I have an immediate idea of how the lights are going to look. And then I just start placing lights. I have a bad habit, admittedly, of putting way too many lights, like Christmas Vacation Griswold amount of lights on my house. I'm trying to get better about it. I just really don't like the way the lighting works sometimes in this game, where things are really dark for almost no reason, and you're like, why is the ambient light not reaching the things it's supposed to reach? But you know, it is what it is. So that's probably why I do that. But as you can see, I'm just going through, I'm placing decorative lamps in addition to the wall lamps to brighten up the spaces that need it. And I tried to be a bit more subdued on this one, so please admire my restraint. So our penultimate tip, 14, is to adjust the ambient lighting. And the way I do this is, well, you've got these little light guys, which are super cute and great accents. But you've also got this saucer thing, which is also a pool light, I guess. And I really like this for if you've just got garden beds and you want to just light them up a bit. Whilst it might not be the most natural look, it, in my opinion, really, I think, makes things pop a bit more. Because it's really just a shame to have these completely dark blobs sitting there when you've got otherwise a perfectly lovely lit up space. And I mean, you could put these little lights all the way in the back and stuff, but I just think sometimes it's just easier to have the little saucers there as ambient light. So as you can see, I just go through, I adjust it. Sometimes you kind of have to wiggle it a little bit and move it because there are some plants that are not lit up in the direction that you think they would. You kind of have to play with it. But yeah, as you can see, I just continue to light up the house in ways that hopefully make sense, and decide to put a little light under the roof line, which I think I do in way too many houses, but I think it looks kind of cute. So here we go. Everything's lit up. I think it's looking all right. For my last light, I decided I wanted something that was not a garden lamp, but something a little bit more decorative. In this case, I decided to go with these little guys, which if you resize them down, it's still a little bit ridiculous how big the flame is, but it doesn't look quite as weird as when you try to resize the 3 and the flames are actually in the wrong spot. So as you can see, that's what I've done there. So this takes us to our finished product. Here we go in the daytime, as you can see. I've got some before and after photos for you to really let it sink in. It's just amazing how different the place looks. I mean, I haven't changed anything on the house other than raising the foundation and moving the position of the door. And it really has made this space part of the house. It's enhanced the decor. It's given you way more usable space for your sim. And it's pretty. So I hope this has been helpful. I'm going to leave you with one last tip, which is my personal favorite because I enjoy it the most. And that is find some, and I'm really sorry for this, Simspo. So basically just watch other videos. Look at what other builders do. There are some insanely talented simmers out there who just unbelievable the kind of things they think about, and I always am blown away by their innovation. So that is all. Thank you so much for watching my video and bearing with me. Hopefully these tips will be helpful, and if you have any questions, just comment. Let me know if there's anything you would like a further tutorial on. I certainly will make more. In between the build videos that I do. I just thought this would be a really great opportunity to show my thanks to everyone who's been active lately, subscribing and watching my videos. I think you guys are awesome, so thank you so much, and I hope that you all stay well.